Alright, well, thanks for coming to our Importing from Japan panel. So to get us started, why would you want to import something from Japan? Might be different sizes and closing. You know, you might have something kind of like a doujinshi or something that's unique that you can't get overseas. A lot of stuff over there, particularly related to anime, can be limited edition, particularly like Blu-ray, DVD sets, CDs. Just about anything related to anime can be some kind of rare out-of-print item. You might be wanting to translate, which we'll be covering in the latter half of this panel. There's a lot of information, particularly about anime or in print, that we just simply don't get over here. A lot of stuff in the back of art books and other places. In some cases, it might be cheaper. Most often, that's not the case. But, there's a lot of scalpers over here for things like specialty DVD sets and that, where you might be better off to getting it directly from Japan through a broker. Certain country restrictions, a lot of things like automotive parts coming from Japan are restricted, so you may not be able to get a hold of that unless you go through a broker. You might want to do a broker business, in which case you'd be acting as an in-between for things like Yahoo Auctions or Amazon Japan. Be able to get stuff to your friends. Different things that you may have trouble kind of surmounting. Obviously, a language barrier if you don't speak Japanese, read it. Again, the automotive parts, one of the things that they do, because we've got the EPA over here and the restrictions on how much pollution the parts commit, not to mention the safety standards are a lot different in Japan. They're a lot more loose. You can't import a lot of those materials. Japanese credit cards and funds transfer. A lot of things over in Japan are done by bank transfer or wire transfer, even for doing auctions. Some of the websites will actually reject your order if they have to do a currency conversion, or they know by either Visa or MasterCard that it's a out-of-country card, so you may not be able to do that kind of purchase. The conversion rate, which is about 1,000 yen to about $10, which we'll mention again later, depending on what your own Visa, MasterCard, American Express does. In some cases, your bank may not allow you to do that overseas because generally they figure it's part of fraud. Many auction sites and stores as well have gotten to the point where they don't want to ship outside of Japan. It has to be a local order. So your physical address may play a role in that. They're also blocking on IP addressing, so in some cases you might have to use a VPN or otherwise, get into a Japanese router in order to make an order in some cases. Device DRM, if you're looking at doing like ebooks, some videos, K-dramas, things like that, it can prevent you from getting it outside the country. Particularly Amazon is really picky with the Kindle. They've been fighting in kind of a never-ending battle with people trying to break that standard over and over. Operating systems, even like Windows over there, it's not just a matter of changing your fonts and like your basic settings around, and like if you had Windows XP or something like that, you may actually have to have a Japanese version of Windows, Mac, etc. for a game or a particular kind of software to run. The App Store and Game Store lockouts, that's kind of going back to like the Kindle, things like that. Again, you have to have a Japanese branded device. It's actually in the ID and the hardware ID of the device that keeps you from running those type of applications. Hardware region locks, just like Blu-ray, DVD, those are set by region 1, region 2, whether it's for Europe, Asia. Some cases like game consoles, Nintendo's kind of famous for doing that. The Xbox, Sony's been a little bit more open. Why should I have anything to say about any of this? Basically, from 2005 onward, I've been acting as an in-between broker. Like that shows, I've had about 55 sales over about 8,000 in purchases. Still sitting on some old Tenchi Muyo type stock stuff from that Phantom. It was one of those things where a bunch of people said, hey, we'd like to get this stuff. And they said, we don't know how to do it. So I said, well, what if I could make it happen? Of which, the Tenchi Muyo community, if you're not aware, is kind of one of the old father of harem anime series. It kind of died out in the early 2000s. I used Abandonware, which was at the time Kanji OCR, which was a little image processor program that would look at a graphic like a bitmap, and it had to be a 1-bit bitmap, which is really hard to make. It would scan it and look at the characters and would try to do its best guess as to what Japanese character that was. Was not very efficient. It had a lot of errors. Used a lot of stuff like Babelfish, Yahoo Translator back in the day before Google got into it. It was slow. It was inefficient. It didn't work very well, but it was better than nothing. I've shipped to Europe, Germany, down South America, a couple other places. The federal fraud was kind of nice because back when the PSPs and that came out, everybody was still doing things by money order. If you remember Yahoo auctions, that was kind of the wretched hive of scum and villainy. They didn't have a whole lot of restrictions in place. It kind of was just catch as catch can. Scan later, in the Tenchi Muyo community, we had a couple different people besides myself that were getting things out of Japan, and the scan later, which is somebody that'll get the raw materials in Japan. Generally, they'll have a friend over there. They'll scan them and then send that over the web to whoever's requesting it. What I was doing was actually buying it, waiting for it to ship, getting it in, sending it back out to folks as I got it. Because of that time lag, the guy who was getting the scans and posting them before I could sell what I was buying was actually causing quite a bit of a headache. Did a little bit of translation, did some manga translation, which we'll show here a little later on. Also did some doujinshi. Been working on a game for a little while. There's actually a Tenchi Muyo version of Zelda, like the original Game Boy Zelda, that was hidden on a different game CD. And we found that out after a while, so we got a copy of it. And of course, in the 2010s and later on, some of the Tenchi community decided that rather than just do the doujins and manga and things like that, that they'd try to tackle a novel, which they did complete, and now they're working on some other things, but translating a novel is a massive feat unto itself, which we'll get into here a little bit more. Here's some places that you can buy different things from, some more popular ones. Several of these actually do have English equivalents. Like Amazon Japan does have an English mode. It's not very good about giving you detail, but you can set up an account. You can use an outside address for some items. You can use international, credit cards, things like that. Rakuten actually took over Buy and a number of other smaller kind of shop networks, and now have their own auction service too. Yahoo Auctions is probably the most notable of anything in this list because they have the largest inventory of anything. They are equatable to our eBay. They actually pushed eBay out of Japan because they couldn't make any headway there against Yahoo Auctions. They're that large and well known. Several of these like K-Books, Mandarake, our old bookstores, Mellon Books. And as I just mentioned, Amazon, Buy, Rinkia, several others for Rakuten. Yahoo Japan now does have a affiliate that allows them to work with international buyers. which is part of Bai and Tenso, which we'll cover here in a little bit about addressing. Cosplay would be one if you're looking for outfits or other things for cosplay accessories that are only in Japan. They're a fairly famous brand as well. Bookwalker would be one that might interest you if you're looking at getting light novels or manga from Japan in digital format. What's a doujinshi? Doujin meaning same person, shi meaning periodical, so it's basically meaning self-published. And they just recently, here in the last couple of years, added the doujin mark there in the right corner. Even though the numbers there about it being 27.7 billion yen spent in 2007, that's probably at least quadrupled since then, as attendance rates have increased year after year with Comic-Cat and a lot of the other conventions. What's a broker? As I did it, just acting as an in-between, you can have kind of a broker and you also have a sub-broker. So let's say you either know someone in Japan or there is another entity or a business that you can order things through. In some cases, they'll go out to the individual shops and on foot buy what you're looking for. A lot of cases, it's just an order service. In many cases online, if they can get the URL for what you're looking for, they'll go ahead and order it for you. They'll receive it, charge you for, the goods and services up to that point. And then once they've received that payment, then they'll release it out of Japan and ship it to you. One of my favorites to act as a broker has been Shopping Mall Japan. I've done most of my business through them. It's nice that they're based locally. Nick, the owner in there, has been above board for many, many years, doing a good job. A couple of the other ones that are more notable that have popped up in, say, the last 5-6 years, like From Japan and the Auction J Subculture, have decent rates as well, but Shopping Mall Japan's been like $3-4 per order for their fees. So it's really not bad at all in the grand scheme of things. They also do drop shipping, so if you get multiple items, they'll do a bulk shipment over in one order rather than charging you individually. Selga has been around a very long time, if they're possibly not one of the first brokers. Unfortunately, they've always been really expensive, and they don't really update you very well on where your product is sitting. Tenso is a addressing service, so you basically sign up with them and you'll have a Japanese address that you can use. Now that means you can either have things shipped there, you can do your auctions, you can use that as a registration for game purchases, app purchases, books, different things. So that can be very helpful, and it's free. So there's really no reason not to have one if you're interested in getting stuff. Here's an example of Yahoo Auctions Japan. Which, one of the things to note is you've got the sidebar menu over there on the left. Just like pretty much any major website, if you mouse over any of these, what you'll end up with down here in the bottom is actually your English conversion of it. So it might say, hats, jeans, auto parts. In this case, it'd probably be video games and toys, as your title. So you can kind of navigate that way and just kind of maneuver around. That's not necessarily the most efficient way. This is kind of would be one of their auction pages. Like down in here, you would have your basic auction information, how much time is left, what type of auction it is. You've got your bid price up here and a bid button, who's doing the selling, what their feedback is. It's pretty equatable to how eBay looks. And this has changed quite considerably from how it was even 5-6 years ago. Compared to how Shopping Mall Japan does things, is they actually load the product page through a kind of a web portal, and it does the translation for you. But you've got some different choices for different translations down here, which pops out of that button. But again, it just reconverts the information to a different format. You'd still have the same description block down here, which when you're trying to do some of those, not necessarily is your description very clear, either because of the translation or maybe the seller just didn't put a lot of effort into it. It's important if you're doing this even through a broker that's converting these pages to try and read it in different translators, because I mean, it may not come out the right meaning. You may be getting something that's used, damaged, it could be just about anything. It could be a knockoff. It's hard to really say. But the more information you've got, the more pictures you've got, the better your chances are of getting what you actually want. Talking about exchange rates, you can use Google search and actually get a accurate conversion. You can just say, like, that is 1,000 JPY to question mark USD, and it'll spit it out. But XE.com is another one that's been around at least probably a decade and goes through and gives you your conversion if you want something up to date. Like I said before, about 1,000 yen is a good rule of thumb for roughly $10. It kind of goes up and down. Lately, it's been a little bit more on the low side, so that means our dollar has more spending power. And if you're buying a lot of stuff or something that's particularly expensive, like a couple $100s, that can save you a few tens of dollars. So the bigger concern with that, though, is when we break it down into this broker invoice example, they charge you based on what the yen selling price was. Your broker will give you your broker fee for that. So if it ended up being just under the limit until they knock you up into the next fee tier, again, that can save you another few bucks. So if you're looking at buying for yourself, it's a little bit cheaper, but if you're looking to reship and you're having to buy boxes and tape and packing material, a lot of the Japanese cardboard and that is of a weak kind of quality. It's easy to kind of fold and manipulate. It's not very stiff at all. So you're probably, no matter what you do, going to have to rebox it. If you're just buying for yourself, of course, you don't have to deal with all that. But like in the example there, you can take a $50 starting item and make it 105 plus real quick. Some things they won't handle: pressurized containers like spray paint, aerosols, hairspray, anything probably wouldn't go on a plane. We already talked about the auto parts a little bit. A lot of international communities don't want pornography in any way coming through customs, particularly child porn or hentai, any of that stuff. Pretty much the same rules apply to like going on a plane, perfume, explosives, animals, etc. Also, nothing cash on demand. Something you could try and do, like I mentioned before, if you're using an English version of Windows, you probably want to install your Asian font packs. Those are mostly built in at this point, or it'll download for you. That'll help you be able to copy and paste and deal with Japanese characters. The Japanese site structure that I mentioned there is much like the let's see, go back here, like the Yahoo auctions page. Dealing with that, you've got your site structure, and besides your section over here, you've got a regular search bar. You're going to have a couple different tabs for what type of search you want to do, and the rest of this is fairly self-explanatory. You got a profile page, favorites. It's all pretty straightforward. Something you can do if you're looking for a particular series or maybe a character item, something with a specific name, you can go to Wikipedia. You can sometimes go to Google. Again, if it's anime, you can go to the news network. Go ahead and search that, and generally they will have it in Japanese next to the English, and then you can just copy and paste that and do whatever search engine. You can also search Amazon Japan in English, and sometimes you'll come up with the right thing. If you're looking for CDs, DVDs, stuff like that, every bit of that generally has a model number assigned to it, or like a SKU. So that will probably be your easiest method to try and get some of those items. The browser plugins that I mentioned there are pretty much all translation helpers or auto translators, much like Chrome has a built-in one through Google Translate. But those will help if you're looking for, again, a specific character. There's maybe something that the regular translator isn't really handling very well. If you want to copy and paste stuff in and get a different translation, what we'll be talking about later too with doing basic translation through a application, you probably will still want to have those type of browser plugins available to you, because a lot of the old stuff like the AltaVista, Babelfish, World Lingo, pretty much anything that isn't Google Translate anymore has largely died away at this point. Besides the searching for Japanese characters, you can also do a more top-level search, like trying to get to, if you're looking for a specific anime series, if you're on like an auction site, something like that, you might start with just the series name and whittle it down. It might be a lot of work, but that's one way of getting to it. You can also use the kana, which is the hiragana or katakana sheets, and copy your characters if there's something missing in order to make up a name or title, and do it that way. Optical translation, you can use a app on your phone, either iOS or Android generally, and basically use the camera feature on it, and it'll translate in real time what you're looking at, or you can take a snapshot and kind of run your finger over the text, and it'll try to give you a translation. And you can also copy the original store URL to another translation engine. That would be more like if you're trying to go from Google Translate to like Yahoo Translate or something like that. See if you can get a different read on it. Again, kind of like the auctions. And going along with the idea of using Tinso or another type of shipping service, it's helpful to know how to address a Japanese international shipping label. Obviously if you're doing brokering, you might get a lot of these in the mail, but in some cases you might have to send something back. Theirs is a little bit different from ours. You've got sort of the ubiquitous Japanese post character, and then you've got your code not only for the city, so forth. Talking about Surface, SAL, Economy versus Airmail and EMS. Pretty much the first two there, you could be looking at months. I've seen packages take up to 6 months to even show up when shipped through Surface. They generally also don't have tracking information, so they're generally kind of a pain that way. You are looking at it being very cheap, like say $5 to $15 for that. Personally, I don't think that it's worth it. Airmail and EMS is equatable to like our International Priority Mail, International Express. You're looking at anywhere from, the quickest I've seen, it's about 3 days to maybe 14 at the most. So, plus that gets you your tracking information. When you do tracking, often, as long as it hasn't hit the U.S. coast and gone into customs, you'll actually get better tracking results going to the Japan Post, which does have a English website. You'll get better tracking results that way. Like I mentioned before, the cardboard is pretty weak. It bends, it folds, it punctures. It's almost like wet cardboard. They also pack everything in newspaper over there that you tend to get, so pretty much everything smells like spoiled fish because they use the fish-based ink in the newspaper and other printing. Let's see. A couple of things before we get too much deeper into the translation side of things. But when you try to do Japanese translation, realize that context is kind of the king of all. You really need to understand what your subject is, what your characters are. If you're dealing with a like a manga or something like that, if you can read the English material that's already been produced, get a feel for the characters, how they talk, are there any specific things they call each other, pet names or anything like that, that you can read into. Because once you start getting into the translating itself, it's going to be real hard to run across that and equate it possibly to what other English translators have made it out to be. And maybe if you're doing something from scratch that has never had a English translation before, I mean, that could be up to you, what you do with it. It's also worth noting that with the way their sentence structure works, where the subject tends to come at the end of the sentence instead of the beginning like it is in English, how Yoda speaks in Star Wars is actually based on Japanese. So it's reversed. Oddly enough, when you watch Star Wars in Japanese, that's completely normal to them, and they don't see it as any different. So he's not really a guru. But like that says, some things that you can accomplish, mostly written text. Handwritten text from a lot of authors is just completely illegible. They like to also use flourishes and look like they're using ink brush fonts and things that just is not able to be recognized. It's good as a study aid as you try to translate, because it gives you something to reference if you want to look up individual characters. If you're looking at something that has a lot of background imagery, though, it's going to be pretty much impossible to try to translate it. You want clean text. If it's not something that you can fix with Photoshop, it just depends on how much time you really want to spend on it. As for a warning, what I'm about to get into with doing scanlations, essentially, is taking generally RAWs or scans of documents, whatever, working that through Photoshop, working it through a OCR program, running it through translation software, cleaning it up, polishing it, putting it back on a page. If you ever want to work in the industry, a while back, I want to say it was around 2006, 2007, Funimation's convention manager at the time gave a pretty damning panel about if you work in scanlations or you try to have your real name associated with a handle or anything when you're doing that, releasing it on the web, they will go out of their way to blacklist you in the industry. For myself, anything that I ever did wasn't for profit. If anything, we've only ever had a couple of little releases. I don't think the entire story is just, it's not necessarily black and white. Perhaps there's a little bit of gray area in there, because a lot of the scanlations and how people are doing fan dubbing or fan subbing of programs before they get released domestically over here is how a lot of those companies like Funimation and that gauge interest. So, like The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, a lot of people didn't think that one was going to be a hit up until it started getting into the fan community. So, but just as a warning, if you want to do scanlating or getting into the industry, at least use, some kind of handle. Don't use your real name. Try not to release stuff. It's more for personal interest and kind of being like a archaeologist where you're uncovering things. So discussing the language itself, hiragana and katakana are collectively called kana. You've got hiragana is used for your native Japanese words, katakana foreign loan words, names, titles in some cases. Kanji, you've got, it's borrowed characters from the Chinese alphabet, if you want to call it, or linguistic. You've got kanji, which are also much more complex, and you've got a stroke order that has to be followed when you're writing them. Like I said, there's over 50,000 kanji. Even to pass some of the basic tests, even as a grade schooler, you're looking at 2,100 plus there. If you're working on it, it helps to have multiple monitors at your desk. 3 is kind of my personal best number to use. That way you can have one section that is your original material, one section might be your notes, one section be your end product, and you can just kind of have a nice clean workflow on over. Desktop management software, one of the good ones is called Display Fusion. That way you can actually assign applications of different things to like a virtual cube, and each surface of the cube can be a different desktop. So you can work on multiple things at one time, just kind of flip back and forth. Virtual machine software you might want, especially if you're working on old games, particularly like Windows XP, stuff like that. The reason why is when you start getting into the translation and you have to do a lot of screen captures, stuff like that, you want to pick up where you left off. Instead of having to play that game all the way from the beginning, wherever the start point is, you can just freeze it, and the whole thing is ready for you right when you want to go back to it. Again, unless you're working with really old games, you probably want something at least Windows 7 or newer. Different types of scanners. There's a wand type scanner that you can use and by hand kind of drag it across your page. That's useful for certain books that have big spines, different things like that. They've also got ones where you can kind of split the page and kind of set it down inside of it like a V. That helps in some cases getting right up into the spine of the book, getting the full page. You'll also want at least 400 DPI scans, otherwise the quality doing optical character recognition it won't be able to pick much up. 200 and under, you won't see anything at all. If you've got an old cell phone, you want to do the optical apps that you can download. At least 8 megapixels, if not more. There are more apps available for Android than there are for iOS if you want to get into it or use a old junker phone. The DIY book scanners are something there if you have a lot of material that you have to process. It's as simple as basically stepping on a foot pedal, and some of them are automated enough where it'll actually either blow or suck the page across, so you don't even have to do that. The cheaper ones are manual. They use generally either a repurposed camera, a cell phone, or something like that, and it's just automating the process of taking a photo every time you move it over. For games, you might want Translation Aggregator, and then that whole long list of other programs is pretty much plugins for it or dictionaries that allow you to either have a better translation, or just another translation. We'll get here in a minute as to what the Translation Aggregator plugin does for you for making a names list. The Visual Novel Reader is kind of a more recent option, kind of more consolidated, where it's taking a lot of different tools and putting it into one thing. If you're doing Aerogay games or other type of games that have a kind of a script that it can pull from, it'll actually hook into the game, read that script, translate it, and spit it back out, in some cases, back into the game, so it's translated on the fly. Cheat Trans 2 or Lite are both also another pair that I'd say probably within the last couple of years that have come out to do that. The other ones under resources, you've got just a lot of tools there that can be of use to you. Japanese doesn't use quotation marks, they use brackets. There's also different characters They do use like the exclamation point. Their period is a little bit different than ours, so the typographic symbols is helpful to just kind of memorize or look through to understand what you're using. Instead of the plugins that we mentioned before for like Firefox and Chrome, that's pretty much what remains of the individual translation sites if you wanted to copy and paste a lot of text. The Take Hymns guide there, the top group of learning, is probably one of the most referenced Japanese learning guides on the internet. It's fairly in-depth. Japanese for the Western Brain is fairly good as well. One of the other ones I recommend, which let me see if it's on this next slide. Nope. One of the other apps that I would recommend is actually Human Japanese, which is on Android. I think it's on iOS, but they've got several apps. They're only a couple of bucks, but it takes you through, and not only can you tap on the word that you're trying to learn in order to get it spoken to you, but it goes into how it's built, what the characters are, where you would use it. It's really nice, in depth, and it covers a lot of the material that you'd need to know in order to properly use the word or term, or even something like in a social setting where Japanese is a lot more in depth than English is. If you're looking at trying to translate novels, Bakasuki is kind of one of the oldest standbys that's still around. If the novel or material does get licensed, they do take it off of there. Manga Helpers is another one if you want tips or possibly looking for help trying to do something with manga. If you want a tutorial on how to clean a manga, that would be a good place to start. If you're reading a series and want to get involved, generally at the start or at the end of whatever you're reading, more than likely your favorite translator team is probably in need of help. So they probably appreciate it. Speaking to a mountain's worth of patience, basically no matter what you do with translation, it's a massive time sink. More often than not, it's not going to do what you want it to do. More often than not, it's going to take you maybe 4 or 5 hours to even translate a paragraph. So prepare yourself for a lot of time sink and just kind of having to wrap your head around it. This was taken from a Ohio thesis, I believe. But as I'll read it off here. As you see, the dictionary isn't always right. There isn't one right translation for any particular sentence. Sometimes the best translation isn't in the Japanese-English dictionary. Sometimes it's born from the juggling act of maintaining the original author's intent, making the translation as easy to read as possible. It's a translator's job to not act as a lens, but a mirror. He or she must take the author's original intent, understand the meaning of the author's words, realize the audience to whom the author was originally writing, and then accurately reflect that writing style into English. Each author and every story has a feel to it. Some stories are typical colloquial Japanese. Some authors write in a very unique style. Before translating a single word, the mind doing the translating must consider how to adapt all those things into another language so that someone who can't read Japanese can have a similar feeling as possible to the Japanese people reading the original. The author's message with all its nuances must be understood completely before it can be reflected accurately. Now, the reason I bring this one up is because there's kind of two schools of thought in translating Japanese. You've got what a lot of anime companies and that are doing with like the simuldubs. You either are very specific and literal, or you're taking it kind of worth a grain of salt and you're trying to get something similar to the original meaning, which is kind of more of a loose translation. It's kind of like what more the intention was. It's not what was actually said, it's kind of more how they're feeling. I kind of fall more on the side of being literal. if you want to read into what was being said, in a lot of cases you can do that if you know the material. You could always add a translator note or something like that. If you're doing dubbing work, a lot of times you'll see that in movies and different things where in the Japanese a character will be like, be quiet, I'm trying to focus or something. And then in the English dub, they'll come up and you'll have a 11-year-old girl character going, shut up, shut up, shut up. It's not really the same thing. So it kind of just depends on your style and what you're working on. But personally, I feel that translating more literally is more respectful, I think, to the original Japanese. Here's another example. This was actually from one of the novels that got translated using the method that I'm going to describe here a little bit more. This is from a Tenchi Muyo Hasegawa novel. The reason I'm bringing it up is it's talking about the acorns and the wildcats here, which is a Japanese fairy tale. And when you read down through this description, which is a kind of a second-hand summary of it, as you could probably imagine, if this was reversed and then expounded upon, and then half of it's missing as you go to try and translate it, because you're getting only a percentage of what was, actually put on the page, it could be incredibly difficult to ascertain what is being said there. So what you have to kind of do is when you run into something like a fairy tale or a fable, something of that nature, you're going to have to do a lot of research to find out what is actually being talked about, to understand that, and then have to regurgitate it into English and maybe make a reference to it as well so somebody can follow up on it. But it can be really difficult in some cases. Here's something that I translated. This was one of the last chapters of Oh My Goddess. I think it was probably around 130, something like that. A lot of people wouldn't go to the trouble. They'd translate the manga, but they wouldn't actually translate the subtext up in here and all this little fine print. So you never really got that information. And one of the interesting things we had gotten out of this was that there was going to be another OVA after the manga was finished. So, depending on what links you're interested in going to, there's still a lot of information that's available. This is kind of a good example, too, of what happens when you do manga cleaning, which can be done through filters or a lot of Photoshop work, stuff like that. But it takes out a lot of the dust and speckles. Of course, improves your blacks, your contrast, stuff like that. You remove some of the advertising lines on the side, straighten it, do different things. You get another example of the same thing. In this case, you've got a lot of text down here in the small block as well. It's changed out. Now, because I didn't want to go through and have to redraw a ton of the page, all this in here, what I ended up doing is kind of a cheat, was actually just put a transparent block over the top of it and put font on top of that. But that's one simple way you can do it. Here's a good tutorial for doing the manga cleaning. It actually gives you an action set in Photoshop, chained to different shortcut keys. Now it claims you can do it in 5 minutes. I've never really seen it done that fast, but if you want to do it well anyway. But say 15-20 minutes or so, that can really improve your output, make it look nice. Here's another example of a Tenchi Dojinshi, which we're getting into some of the information where we built kind of a form to have to fill out and say, what progress is being done per page. Now, this is a really simple page because there's very little text here. But kind of the first step you want to go through is, of course, scan the page, rip the text off of it, make sure it's 100% accurate and complete. Then you start running it through different translation tools. Like the other one, you had Atlas Dictionary on here. Here's Google Translate's version of it, what you end up with. And then by the time you get done with it, you end up with your variation on what is being said. So then you have basically the before and after with the final product. I wasn't the one that actually typeset that page, so it looks a little weird, but it still works. This is again going back to trying to keep yourself organized as well. If you work with other people, you're going to want some kind of form. Making it as easy for people to work as possible will get you more friends than anything else. But in this case, it was just a copy and paste sheet using a forum, and we'd have everything already pre-laid out so that you could go to the different websites, drop in your translation, drop it back into the code sheet here, and it would spit it out as a forum post. And then you have different titles, that would tell us, what status that page is on, or whether somebody needed to come back through, with better knowledge, trying to do a better conversion of it. Another thing you'll probably run into if you're doing novels is vertical text, which pretty much all of them are. And of course, Japanese is also read from right to left, but you go right down, so you'd be reading this direction. Something else that makes translation a real pain in the butt is for your kanji characters. Let me see here. There's one up here, and over here it's really kind of small to see, but that's furigana, and it's I believe that's kana that is used with the kanji to be able to give you a better idea of what its meaning is. Now, because it's small and because of where it's sitting on the page, when you try to use a piece of software to get an idea of what's being said there, most of the time you don't need it, and it causes misrecognitions. So a lot of times you have to go back through and cut that out. Here's an example of a page that has a whole lot of image background to it, which makes OCR work a real pain too. Basically because the image is sitting behind there, it just causes more misrecognitions. The idea with this was to get the image out of it and then do a negative, which would hopefully render most of the text intact. Going back to what we were talking about before with Translation Aggregator being one of the main programs to use, something you can do that really helps a lot is create a names file. And what this allows you to do is when the aggregator runs across a piece of text, it'll automatically translate that into the English name that you, or whatever, title, etc. on the right side. That's got maybe a 50-50 success rate, depending on what you're working with, because characters can run into each other. It may not be perfect what you've got in the names file. But in this case, our names file that we were using for the Tenchi stuff had probably several hundred, if not maybe even 1,000 different names and things in it. So it was very helpful. Here we're getting into the basics of doing the translation itself. So you've got a scan. Let's say we're working on a doujinshi page or just anything with text. You'd start out wanting to scan and save image. This is Abby Fine Reader, which is the OCR tool. I tested a lot of different programs. Trying to think of the other brand. Adobe Acrobat for a while claimed that they did OCR. I found out that wasn't actually true, unless they've added it into maybe the more recent versions. But Read Iris is another OCR program that's well known in the industry. I didn't find that it was all that accurate, actually. The best results I've had has really been out of Abby, which isn't all that expensive as far as software goes. It's like, I think, about $70 to $90, so it's really not all that bad. But you take your image, you'd import it. You have to select up in here, You have to set the program to Japanese recognition. And when it imports, it'll automatically set recognition grids on top of everything. Now, like what I was talking about before with handwritten text, that's basically what that would come down to. It's machine printed, but it still looks like handwritten text. So what you end up over here is not accurate at all. But you can also go down through using some of the tools up here, set the recognition area different, block it out. Then you go through the process of proofreading it. So you're going to have to go through character by character, figure out what's broke, what isn't. In this case, what it's doing is it's going over a line that it thinks it interpreted improperly, and it's marking it in blue here, and it's giving you potential things it thinks it could be close to. More often than not, these actually aren't the character you're looking for, so you have to go out to the internet, find the character, hunt it down. Something else that I tend to do is when you run across a character and you just want to come back to it later, to mark an error, just put an asterisk, because those don't tend to show up in Japanese very much at all. Plus, it's easy to search for something that's a common. But here, after we've done our proofreading and editing, you've got Translation Aggregator open there on the right, and it's got dictionaries for Atlas. It'll go out and send it out to Google, different translation ones here. Some of the most helpful ones that it's got is built-in dictionaries. You've got the MECAB, the JParser, and the WWJDIC. Those will give you individual characters or groups a ridiculous amount of information like that on a character, how it could be used, other meanings, and that's not uncommon to have something with that much detail pop up. So you really have to pay attention to how it's being used in context to understand generally what they're trying to use it for. Again, if you're looking at vertical text, here you're doing it kind of line by line. Again, you do have your sentence breaks, which, like I said, their period is more like a circle with a hole in it, kind of like a donut. But often you have to go through it basically sentence by sentence. Picking out individual words may not give you anything similar to the real meaning. I'll let you kind of read down through that. But if you'd like to get into the anime industry, that's more of the proper method of doing it. Bottom line is you pretty much have to have a demonstratable skill set and a portfolio that references that, and if you want to get anywhere. It's worth noting there in the bottom block too, the Los Manitos Language Company. It's a little farther east of the Highlands area, and I think they have Japanese language courses starting around, I think it was around $100. So, that's a real low entry point. If you're wanting to get like a regular tutor as part of a scholastic program, something like that, those can range into the thousands of dollars real easy. So that would be a good entry point. There used to be a couple of Japanese language groups on Meetup and some of the other social networks around here, but those have kind of disappeared in the last couple of years due to inactivity. Of course, after you've got portfolio experience and references, you can look at going to Crunchyroll or Funimation. If you're going to try to get into something like the simul dubs, stuff like that, simulcast, that's going to be really intensive work. That's probably not something that you're going to get right out of the bat unless you've got a massive amount of background saying that you can handle it. If you're wanting to get into the game industry, same kind of idea that you have to have a portfolio, but it's a little bit easier less of a barrier to entry. You can try doing the lockjam convention. That, and there's always a lot of kind of indie game projects that are looking for, you know, entry-level translators. A lot of apps out there, especially mobile apps, stuff like that, where you can get in kind of the ground floor. As the in there discusses, you know, when you go over to Japan, it's still very much a society that looks as outsiders or gaijin, particularly Americans, other folks. If you're not of Asian descent, you will always be an outsider there. Not just because we're taller or, you know, more pale skinned or whatnot. It's even people that have worked there for many years are still treated that way. It's something that actually the government itself has gotten into before they get into the Olympics here coming up in a couple of years that they're trying to address. Other than that, that's all we've got for right now. So thank you for coming to our translation panel.